Previously on agentpalmer.com, Zinoman's biography of David Letterman should make your top 10 list of late night. The Catcher Was a Spy isn't just for baseball and espionage fans, and have you tried or checked out any of Alex and my shared fandoms from last episode? This is the Palmer Files, episode 142 with Ken Sweeney, host of the Comfortable Spot podcast. We discuss being curious, podcasting, creating and momentum, starting in music, success and replication, the voice as an instrument, Star Trek, old television, keeping it classy, Dick Cavett, and much, much more. Are you ready? Let's do the show! Hello and welcome to the Palmer Files. I'm your host, Jason Stershik, also known as Agent Palmer, and on this 142nd episode is Ken Sweeney, host of the Comfortable Spot podcast and producer and editor of many more. We discuss podcasting, which happens whenever two podcasters get together. It's really just something that happens. And then we get to talking about music and the momentum of creating, as well as success and replication, Star Trek, old television, keeping things classy, and the eternally underrated Dick Cavett. All of that and more is coming your way shortly. But first, remember that if you want to discuss this episode as you listen or afterwards, you can find all related ways to contact Ken and myself in the show notes. You can visit Ken's website, thecomfortablespotpodcast.com, where on the About page, you'll also find links to the Moldovan Coffee Break and Lydia's Booktastic podcast, shows he mentions during this episode. Don't forget, you can see all of my writings and rantings on agentpalmer.com, and of course, email can be sent to thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. So without further ado, let's get into it. Ken, you host the Comfortable Spot podcast, and I just want to start with this. That podcast seems like someone who is curious. Have you been curious forever? Like, was this just an inevitability?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of. I suppose so. I mean, it's kind of curious, but it's also an opportunity to kind of talk to my heroes in a sense. It kind of started off like that. I had this list of people that I said, okay, the only way I'm actually going to get to talk to these people is through the medium of podcasting. And I found that podcasting is incredibly good for that. You know, like you manage to get where BBC or NBC can only get. You know, 10 years ago, this would have been impossible to talk to a pop star or a well-known writer. And, you know, to be honest, a lot of the people that I interview on my podcast are kind of heroes of mine. Even if it's kind of somebody that I've only discovered maybe in the last couple of years. It doesn't really matter. I kind of get into that groove when I'm reading their book or following them on Twitter or, you know, listening to their music. And that's where it kind of goes, you know? And it's like, it's been through a lot of episodes. Mostly my series are about 10 episodes.
Okay.
So that kind of gives me time to kind of have a break and then reassess what I want to do. So it's not been a kind of continuous thing like your podcast, say.
Well, but I'm also every other week. So like I've built in that time to like if I record 2 in a week, I have a month to kind of recuperate. But I do want to ask you this question. You started with a list.
Yeah.
But obviously you've covered as much of that list as you can. You're well, you've been doing this for years now. You've done many's of episodes. Like, do you, and I have this problem, do you now look at the world in that way where it's like, I just finished reading this great book. Wow, he'd probably be a good podcast guest. Or like, I listened to this album and she'd be an amazing like, do you look at the world now as like, oh, well, I'd love to talk to them. I'm going to invite them on the show.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I just kind of have a few rules where I don't get involved with guests, and that's kind of like the guests don't want to know what I am, who I am. They don't want to know my opinions or or my, goals or anything like that in life. So it's not really a kind of one-on-one conversation where you're toing and froing. There's long pauses, like where they get a lot of things to say. And, I kind of come in then with a question based on their answer, but it's not kind of very quick fire like what you would hear nowadays in modern radio. And I think modern radio actually has lost that wonderful essence of the long conversation. They tend to have you always get the impression that the presenter's on a time clock and he's kind of getting as many questions in as he can, stopping the guest halfway through a point. And that's one thing that I wanted to make sure that the Comfortable Spot was never going to be. So you might listen to an episode where you might have a guest talking for 10 minutes nonstop, and they love to do it. So I'm not the type of person who jumps in and does that.
If I am, but that's also because that's the way I am in real life. Like if you tell a story, I'm still going to interrupt you because like there are pieces of any story that will fascinate me as we go through. Right. Yeah. Like maybe you're 5 minutes into a 20-minute story. I'm going to interrupt you and be like, hey, but what about that thing? Because I feel like we're going to go past it and move on. And I want to know about that thing. And then we'll get back to the story. And that's the way I am in real life. But I agree with you that some of it's the medium in that podcasting allows for that. But the other part is, because we're not on a clock, we don't have to go to the weather in 5 minutes or traffic in 20, and we don't have to like get out of here for the next show. It always seems like it's not just that they're in a hurry. There's also the lack of listening. I think it's the listening. I think hosts. Yeah. Not across the board. It's not categorical, but I think a lot of that like terrestrial radio, the hosts don't listen. They're not listening to you say that like you started your podcast by getting a list of your heroes that you wanted to talk to. They're going to go, well, he's got a podcast. I'll just let him talk about that for a bit. Sure.
And I agree with you. And you see, the other thing is like with podcasting, I think a lot of people are using it to just kind of air their views and talk about themselves or whatever they're interested in. And that's absolutely fine, but I just didn't want that podcast that I'm doing to be like that. I guess there was a little bit of kind of awestruck as well with some of them, so here I am talking to somebody who I've been very fond of, think their writings are excellent, or maybe whatever movie they've starred in, I really loved. So I'm kind of like, in a little sense, I'm sitting back and just kind of been a bit awestruck. So that was kind of the theme in the first or second seasons. After that, I kind of started to bring in people who had maybe approached me with a concept or a book or whatever. And then it was kind of changing a little bit different. So I think now it's going to be in its sixth season. I'm going to be starting off now. I've kind of a different targets for guests. I'm kind of looking at guests who can bring something to the podcast that can kind of enhance it and maybe bring it up to a different intellectual level. And also I know this sounds very cliched, but they kind of help me grow a little bit as well, to kind of understand things that maybe I wasn't that interested in and kind of exploring it that way. Whereas before, the previous 5 series had been my interests. So it might have been about ancient history, or it could have been about, the soccer in the 1970s in America, but now I've kind of done all that big bucket list. I'm kind of open now to new ideas,
Well, I like that because it feels like you did the one thing I tell everybody to do. You're a podcaster and you've been in and around audio. I mean, a short look at your bio says that you are a man who's not uncomfortable with the microphone, the wires, the knobs, and the sliders.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, keep your show as open-ended as possible. Because if you're going to do a thing about one thing, you're going to get sick of that one thing.
Yeah, that's true.
And I love the idea that you don't have to start a new show or rebrand in order to start going after things that will teach you. Instead of deepening your existing knowledge, it will give you new knowledge. And you don't have to rebrand to do that. I'm in love with that. That's why I started this show, because I I want to just talk to people. I think everybody's got a story. Everybody's interesting.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be kind of somebody who's well known. I mean, like some of the guests that I've had, for example, my last guest there in the previous series would have been Stephen Zhao, who was a young lad, 17 years of age, an incredibly good photographer based in Los Angeles. Now, I would never have found him, only that he got in touch with me. So, I kind of said, okay, I had a look at what he was doing and I just became a fan, So even though it was only new to me, and to be honest, I mean, I would have done photography, but it would have been kind of now stand there in that line, stand over there and I'll take a picture, that kind of thing. So I wasn't looking at abstract views, but, as a kind of a, in my caveman appreciation, I thought some of his images were amazing. But what I really appreciated about it was that he was 17 and he sounded very mature, because what I generally do, Jay, is I talk to people beforehand to get a kind of a lay of the land and what way they talk, what are their tics, what are their, there's nuances and that kind of thing. So I can get a good idea. It's not kind of fresh to me when I'm just about to record.
Yeah.
And what I did find was he was incredibly mature. So that's what really won me over. So I kind of learning a little bit. That's what I'm saying with the last series. It was a little bit more like people I didn't know, but I kind of got newly interested in, or people I've known for a while. They might have been close friends. And that's the way it was going. So, yeah, I'm really happy with that. I think I've done a huge amount of episodes. And you know yourself, it's difficult to keep the momentum going. Sometimes you just get tired and you just go, oh, I don't know, I have to do that now. I have to get it done. I have to get it ready for Monday. Sometimes that can happen. So I always advise people to take even a kind of, like I've taken a 7-month break from now with this. So, it's kind of something that I'm going back to with a much keener, fresh.
I'm so jealous. Like, I mean, because I didn't think about seasonality. Like when I tell people keep your show as open as possible, if you get bored, most of the time it's because you want to do something else. And the idea of creating one show and not having to relaunch and rebrand every time is great. The other thing I always tell people is do seasons, because every other a week releases gives me a break in production, because I can like batch record a bunch and then save them and release them, and like, oh, I don't have to record for the next 2 months, I'm covered. But it also means I'm still always on the lookout for the next thing. I don't have a break. And at this point, some of it is that momentum. Like you don't want to break it. There's a part of it that's just like that. This is what it's time. Let's go. And my production schedule, to go behind the scenes a bit, is that I release on a Tuesday, and on the off Tuesday, the next Tuesday when I don't release, I'm usually finalizing the next episode, right? So it's it's there. You're always in a thing. I could probably work a little bit further ahead, but I usually don't, because I like to remember things. And I've been a blogger for longer than I've been a podcaster, and that's over a decade at this point. And what astounds me about myself is that I will forget the things I've written.
Yeah.
And I will also forget the people that have been on the show. Like I have to casually go back and like look at like, oh, okay, that's okay. All right. That was whatever, episode 73. Like it's just, you get in these rhythms, and I'm addicted to the process. And it's kind of one of the reasons that I'm slightly jealous of you being able to be seasonal having seasons, and taking a break even of 7 weeks, much less 7 months. But I also don't know, because I have friends that have done similar. I've had friends that have stopped podcasting for their break and just never came back because they lost the momentum. So I will ask you, you're in the middle of, you're launching this new season now. What was it like? Let's go back to last year, the end of last year.
Sure.
You're thinking about launching the new season, but you've been off for so long. Like, is it easy to just shake off the dust? How do you build the momentum back up again?
Well, to be honest, the comfortable spot kind of was it's kind of my, it's my public persona for work that I might do elsewhere in podcasting.
Okay.
So, for example, I've been involved with 4 podcast series since then. I did what was one there throughout the year called the Left Bank podcast, and it was basically just a production job doing a political podcast for a political party here in Ireland, a very small the Social Democracy Party here in Ireland. So, it's kind of near my politics, but I didn't want to get involved in the production. Sorry, I didn't want to get involved in the presentation part of it.
Okay.
So it was kind of the idea came about, and I was approached, and I said, I'll do the production for you because, everyone has great ideas. And then when, as you know, they get to the production side and it kind of puts them off, doing the work. So I said, I'll do a production job in that one. So that was one. And then I've worked with 2 other podcasts, which I can't say because some of them aren't even released yet. But so I've been busy for the last 7 months, working on podcasting. And, some of those podcasts, they were final. So one is a 10 series one, and one is 10 episodes, and then the other one 7 episodes. And then the political one was kind of, it wasn't set down on a particular day or anything like that because it was running in concurrence with the European elections, which were happening here in Ireland and the rest of Europe. If you remember the European Union, there is a European election. So it ran around that. So, it wasn't kind of set to a date or anything like that. But it was quite extensive, because you're doing, work for other people. So you kind of have to introduce your style into it from the production element, but you also have to cater for their style in the presentation element, which can be very, very different to what I would be kind of comfortable with, excuse the pun. So, I did learn a fair bit from that, and that's the goal. That's actually my goal. I mean, my goal is to produce podcasts that have my stamp on it, and then for people to come to me and say to me, we'd like you to produce a podcast for us, and then kind of go, with their stamp on it. And I think that's, you can become, look, this yourself, you can become a really good producer if you kind of put your own instincts into your pocket and just kind of, allow them to be the influencing factor. And it can turn out okay, a little bit like, if you're producing, say, for an artist or a band, you can't give all of your style to that band, otherwise they're going to lose their individualism. Yeah. So I do the same with podcasts, and it's a huge learning curve for me as well.
I don't talk about it a lot on this show, but like I have a credit and my one paid consulting gig as a producer and editor on the Good Government Show, and as a podcast, a lot of the guys behind the scenes, especially the executive producers that I talk to on a regular basis, they're guys from old media. They're from television. They're from a different thing. And I'm trying to be malleable to what they want, but I'm also aware that they're coming from television, which, let's be real, in the grand scheme of things, television's still relatively new. Podcasting is just radio on demand. So I don't look at podcasting as that new, with the exception that it doesn't have the constraints that, as we talked about earlier, radio does. And so I have these conversations that change the way I look at podcasting with these guys who are coming from successful a success in a different medium where there is a formula of sorts for success. If you're going to put on a news program on television, or a news or a features program, or a documentary on TV, there are certain ways you do it. And then those guys come to me as the producer and they go, "Hey, can we do this? Or can we, how about this or that?" And I'm like, "Well, we can try any of it." Like there are no rules. I like that kind of, but I think it's also a bit unbearable in that there are no right answers. And I think we're on season 4 of the Good Government Show, and I think that my working relationship with them is now that they're aware there are no concrete right answers, we're able to cut through and get to like, this is what we're really talking about. Yeah. But it's still such a wild, wild west because the goalposts keep changing. Everything keeps moving. And nothing in the landscape of media at all says stayed the same, even over the last 5 years. And so for me, the one constant is this show, because with them, I've tried new things and we've tried new things. Here, I'm just like, I'm just going to keep doing this. Like this works out well. But I want to know, where did you get into radio? Like, you could have picked, I don't know if you wanted to, but you could have picked any other medium at all. So why podcasting? Why audio?
Well, you see, I had a long experience being in bands, and in Ireland, I grew up with U2, that kind of rock element, U2, and other bands like there would have been an Irish band here called the I can't think of their names actually at the moment. Oh, Cry Before Dawn were a local band where I was, and they were all very U2 orientated. 4-piece band, live set.
Okay.
And 4-track analog, usual stuff. And then. So as the kind of 80s drew into the 90s, I kind of moved away from the kind of live rock sort of thing and started to go into more dance music orientated. And it was kind of like a crossover sort of thing. And, kind of listening to bands like KLF and stuff like that, and finding that, you can use an electric guitar in a dance song, so I kind of got that experience of working in a studio. And I was a front man in my early days as in a band. So I kind of then got a lot of work as a session musician, because what was happening in Ireland was pop scene was beginning to take off. It was going into that kind of boy band element towards the late 90s. And I had that voice that could do a lot of demos, because as you know, it doesn't matter whether it's the United States or whether it's Ireland, they always have the songs before they have the band members.
That's true.
So,
yeah.
So they need somebody decent to sing the song so they can sell it to the record company. And I was not marketable, for somebody to be in a boy band. Although I might be in the right age, I didn't have the right temperament. I was kind of, I came from the Sex Pistols, do it yourself sort of thing. And the last thing I wanted, some lad telling me how to sing an Osmond song. So, so I just kind of went, no, that's not for me. But I got paid for doing the basically the session demo work. And that's where I had my experience. And then in the early 2000s, I kind of got into politics. I studied a bit on journalism and so on. And I really became heavy into politics, because that was around around 2005, 2006. And, Ireland was, progressing as a country in terms of economically and also culturally and so on. So, everybody had an opinion, and it wasn't about, unemployment or emigration, which was always their issue. So, I kind of got into Europe, and I set up a European blog then around 2010, and that's what happened. We started to do what you did. We started producing media. We started producing articles and so on, and interviews with people and publishing those interviews. And then I discovered this art of podcasting around 2015.
Okay.
And I slowly began to introduce that into the media project that we were doing. And I found then that I produced a couple of series for that, basically around kind of European issues. And that's when I kind of started to move a little bit away. And the first one I started to do, which was kind of more, just for myself, was with my daughter, Lydia. She was 7 years of age, a compulsive reader. And I decided to do a podcast with her because, and I'm sure you're going to nod your head when you hear this, like you listen to any book review for kids' books, and it's either by teachers or parents. There's no book reviews by kids. So we decided to do this around 2017, 2018. And it took off pretty well. We had like over 1,000 people listening to each episode. And, back then it was quite good. So, we still do it the odd time. My other daughter's involved, Lucy, and now it's Lucy and Lydia. But, that's where it got me into social type of podcasts. And then I did a really good podcast with them. I'm have to plug because I was very proud of this podcast. What we did was we were looking at... we're looking at countries in Europe that were still in the progressive stage, mainly countries that are in Eastern Europe and so on. And we focused on Moldova, which is a small European country, not just on the borderline with Ukraine.
Yeah.
So this was before, obviously, the war in Ukraine. So we met up with this young girl who basically wanted to interview young people in Moldova and, get their opinion about life in Moldova. And, we said this could be a set of articles. And that's when I said, no, I actually think we should do it as a podcast. So she interviewed them in Moldova, and then the tapes, do you hear me? I'm showing my age.
It's all right.
The recordings came back to me, and then we turned it into a podcast where she would be a co-host with me. I would be the idiot in the room, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then she would be the expert on a country. So we'd play the interview, And they were very specific. Like, for example, one person was a young doctor, another person was a young journalist, or someone was another chap was a young musician, a classical musician. So, I basically just quizzed Loredana, which was her name, after the interview, which was only about 10 minutes. So we turned it into this lovely podcast called the Moldovan Coffee Break. And it was massive. I mean, obviously it did well in Moldova, but it did very well, around Europe as well. And actually, this was the year just before Ukraine was involved. So I'm sure if you remember when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, there was a fear that Moldova would go as well. So naturally, a lot of people were asking in Google, what is Moldova? Where is Moldova? So that's where a podcast took off for a second time, because it was actually giving a really good insight into a country that maybe had a bad rep. A little bit like, I mean, an example probably would be somewhere like Haiti or Costa Rica on your side of the Atlantic.
If they even have a rep. I mean, that's the other piece to this. And as the European Union was, and as the United States is, like, there is a lot that to be desired when we talk about education of the world. Of the actual world. Like, everybody wants to, I don't say they want to, but we hear a lot about globalization. But, ask anybody to start naming countries that aren't in the top 15. Yeah. I don't know where Moldova would fit, but I don't think it would be in the top 15.
No, I think
even if you went by popularity, those countries that like fall anything below the top 20, and it's like that they're part of globalization too, right? Like we always find this way to ignore them. And you live in a much smaller country than I do. In the United States, we have communities that are like that. We have communities that basically don't exist to everybody. Like, New York and LA, and so do I, but like there are other places in between that even people in America don't know. And
but I think Americans get a bad rap about this. You see this on Instagram a lot, where some smart arse from the UK is interviewing American college students in Europe, and they ask them, like, where's France or where's Spain, and they're kind of rolling their eyes as the young people go, I don't know. And she's just like, I'm watching these and I'm kind of saying, I didn't have a clue where any states in America was when I was 17 or 18. If somebody asked me to name the capital of Arkansas today, I still wouldn't know. If somebody said point Utah on the map without showing the actual states, I'm sure I would say somewhere in the middle. Yeah. So, and I would be considered pretty well versed, particularly in American affairs. I mean, my favorite podcast every single day is Chris Hayes. And, I can be a bit biased, of course, but the point is I listen to it because, it just keeps me in touch with American issues. But I still can't, do that. And I find American people get a bit of a bad rap for that. But, that's kind of easy. They're easy targets,
Yeah, but I just feel like we tend to ignore the little guy unless...
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Unless is never good. There's never, like, it's never unless, like, we found out Wakanda was real and there really is vibranium. Then, of course, everybody knows about Wakanda now. But the unless is usually, like, Moldova is a threat from invasion, and so now we know about them, right? Like, and so I will say I applaud the idea, and the follow through on the Moldovan coffee break, because it shines a spotlight where a spotlight is needed.
Yeah, no, that's true. And like, I tell you, can I have a few minutes to tell you another story where I went with the same concept and it completely blew up in my face. Because I had this project where this was really successful. And the thing was, this is the key to it, right? The key wasn't me, because anybody can edit. This. If you know what you're doing, you have your same kind of setup. It becomes like you could do it and you're blindfolded. But the key was Loredana, because she was not only very intelligent, right? So she was really, really excellent at, going beyond the interview. And delving, and I hate using this phrase, but delving into the interview and kind of breaking it down for idiots like me to understand.
I gotcha.
And she was young as well, so she was fresh. She was always she was always able to do it. She was always on time. She had that Eastern European kind of commitment, because my wife's Polish and she's exactly the same. Completely committed. When they decide on a project, they decide to do it, Jay. So, I had all of those things that were really, really cool that made that podcast work so well. What I tried to do was I tried to duplicate it. So I had this idea where I said, okay, I've got this fantastic idea. And believe me, I still have all these ideas rolling around in my head. I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put together a 6-episode podcast where I interview a woman from Greenland.
Okay.
And I said, it got me going was, Trump was talking about buying Greenland. It kind of said, Jesus, like the ignorance of that. And people in Europe were saying, he can't buy it. It's European. And I was going, that's a nuance, because, it's right in the middle. It's a little bit like Ireland. Sometimes we're more American than we are European here. And it's the same with Greenland. So I thought, what better? Interview local people who are native to Greenland.
Yeah.
I got all the interviews, lined them all up. One was a politician, another person was working for an oil company. So that's kind of a touchy subject when it comes to Greenland.
Yep.
And then another person was a conservationist, and so on. I had all these 6 people, different backgrounds, different ages, all lined up. And then I came across these 2 young girls, and I said, these are media students here in Ireland. One, you couldn't have got it better on paper. One was Danish. So, Denmark has close connections with Greenland. It's still, under governance of Denmark anyway.
Yeah.
So I said, this is going to be perfect. She had one side of her family were Irish, another side of her family were Danish. And then I had another girl who was going to present the show. So it was going to be, one girl was going to replace me, as in the way the Moldovan coffee break. And then this Danish-Irish girl was going to do the interviews and then talk about the interviews afterwards.
Sure.
Well, it was an absolute, complete disaster because they were just not good enough. They just didn't cut the mustard. They didn't have the standard that I had with my previous co-host.
Yeah. So
while the interviewees were perfect, I watched in horror as each interview just went, down 7 or 8 levels of just kind of non-professionalism. And I think I have a point to make to you here, and I'm getting to it now.
No, it's fine.
Is that I think the problem with podcasting is you can get this happening to you. So when you go in with radio, you have a certain level that is going to happen at. So even if you go in with local radio, and I know local radio in America is huge, talk radio in particular, and it's the same here in Ireland and around Europe. That if you even go to a local radio station, the person you're going to be working with on a project like this is going to be fairly good.
Yeah.
You don't have to struggle with it. And I think this is the problem. And I realized that. And 2 things I learned from it. First, trust nobody. And then the second thing, I'm talking about if you're going into a co-partnership or you're teaming up with somebody else to do a podcast, you got to practice with them first. Don't go in blindly on their resume. Don't think that they've done it before, they'll do it again. They don't. And then the other thing is work alone.
So
That's me.
Well, here's my question before I follow that up. What I do, editing, producing, scheduling, and then hosting with a guest, right? Today it's you, but a guest. Would you consider that a solo project?
I'd consider it me kind of, in a sense, when I was listening to your episodes, I got that impression. It definitely wasn't like me, for example, just sitting back and letting, the guests do all the talking. I think there is a bit of a banter, as we call it here in Ireland, between each other. So I'd still kind of, you kind of controlled and, you're the boss, so to speak. I'm not. I'm not going to say, hey, come on, maybe we should do this, but so, that's fine. Yeah. But yeah, but I know what you're saying. I mean, you have to have a kind of certain level. Guests you can get away with because sometimes you can run with them and whatever. Yeah. But if you have a co-host, you're damned, if they're not clicking, it's terrible.
That's why. So the cliff notes of my origin story in podcasting is I started listening to a geek podcast, talking movies, TV, other books, comic books, whatever. Yeah. And, as you do, we interacted on Twitter. And then I, became a guest and, eventually I became a producer behind the scenes, helping them like pick the stories for this week and just being on the call and making clips and helping with promo and stuff. And I did that for not just that show, but a few other shows. So I got to watch behind the scenes as two different podcasts that I was behind the scenes on. One had four guys. And the other was a collective of one guy and usually 1, 2, or 3 other people. The thing that sold me on doing this as a guest podcast was everybody was friends and there was still respect for everybody. But for the most part, Jason, if you're listening, Jason the Angry Ginger, if you're listening, I still love you. But like, it was his show, but he had 5 other co-hosts that all wanted to take it in a different direction. Right. And it was watching that from behind the scenes and being like, I don't know how I don't want to deal with that. That's true. Meanwhile, one of his co-hosts started another show that I helped a little bit with called The Stranger Conversations. And I wanted to bring this concept to you because I feel like it's something maybe it would be worth you trying once or twice. And the bit on The Stranger Conversations was simply that Grant, as the host, was going to call you up at Skype. And you were going to record. And the only thing he knew about you was as little as possible to set up the podcast. Right. So he knows, like, I do a little bit of homework. So I have a general idea of where our conversation can go. But he wanted to go in as completely unknowing as possible, which is why it was called The Stranger Conversations. Right. And I think that my happy medium of where this show currently sits, not just because of the evolution of having done it for years, is because I got in at a time and got to watch those shows and those co-hosts and this other show and this concept. And I went, somewhere in here is something I can do that I am comfortable with. Yeah, I get you. But there's all these other things that could go wrong.
No, that would be a worry for me. You know, but also that concept's gone anyway. You're talking about, say, Ireland being a small country. We have a TV show that does that. There's a very famous Irish comedian called Tommy Tiernan. And what he does is he hosts the Tommy Tiernan show. And basically 2 people, or I think it's 3, come on as guests. And he doesn't know who they are. Okay. So if I was to try it as a podcast in Ireland, everyone in Ireland would go, you're just ripping off Tommy Tiernan. So you see, this is the problem of being in a small country. Okay. It's a great idea. But then if you try and do it, someone else is going to go, gee, Tommy Tiernan, you're copying Tommy Tiernan. So yeah, I like the idea, but I think it's too small for Ireland. You wouldn't get away with that. Somebody would be bound to pull you up on it. But it's still a very brave idea. I don't think I'd be 100% on board with that now, to be honest.
I don't. I mean, I've had. I mean, a lot of the people I have on are strangers. I do a little bit of homework, like I said, but I don't know them very well. But I want to go back with you for a second. You talked about music. Yeah. And in my limited experience, a lot of people who are comfortable with the microphone and the knobs and the dials and the sliders were musicians at some point in their past.
I think so, yeah. Definitely in the early days of podcasting, yeah, absolutely.
I am with you as far as, like, I was in a bunch of cover bands, and I played in a bunch of bands, and I was very comfortable with the when you talk about tapes from before, like, I think about the Tascam Porta Studio, and
that's what I was thinking. I couldn't come to the name Tascam 4-track.
Because I had the 4-track and the 8-track, which if you rendered everything down, you get additional tracks, and it worked out well. But it was. Look,
I'm just thinking of the time we used to spend doing that. It's just
right.
It's insane.
But like, do you still play music now? Like, where does that fall in? 'Cause I still pick up an instrument. I don't play with anybody, but I still pick up an instrument, at least a couple times a week, just to, mess around with the bass or the guitar or something. Like, do you still play?
No. And physically, I'm not able for it. You know, I mean, I'm kind of just what happened was I stood in for a guy in a band about 3 years ago. It was about 8 gigs across the Ireland nationwide.
What were you playing?
I was lead singer.
Okay,
And
all right.
it was, it's the worst kind of scenario, because you got to be like him and you're still trying to kind of, I felt like, taking over from, I don't know, Dave Lee Roth and Van Halen. It's just like it's so impossible to try and do, but you just kind of have to do it anyway. So, I get all these nasty looks from the fans going, who the fuck are you? It's like, and I'm standing there, I'm 3 feet smaller than this guy, and it was kind of a nightmare. And then physically, I was exhausted. Okay. So I kind of said to myself, right, that's it. Because I was tempted at one point. I had a couple of friends of mine who were saying, let's do something kind of off the wall. Let's do a kind of a yacht rock covers band for the laugh. And I was kind of going, that's brilliant. And then I said, no, physically, I just wouldn't be able for it.
Do you miss it?
Sorry?
Do you miss it? Like, do you miss the performing or the whatever?
Sometimes. I would sometimes, but I'd still sing a lot. I mean, the way I kind of know, I guess you'll have a lot of musicians nodding their head when I say this, but I treat my voice like the way I would treat, as a part of my body. So it needs exercise.
Yep.
So I do sing a fair bit. Every week I'd kind of pull out about 20 tracks off my favorite list or whatever and go through it. My daughters are driven insane, listening to me singing Toto, But the thing is, I do that because it helps me with my own talking voice as well. And what I've found that as I get into my 50s, I'm realizing that, I'm having the 50 mark breathing problems. So, I have to kind of slow down, whereas when I was a lot younger, I would have talked a lot quicker. But at the same time, I still practice that. So okay. I don't miss it because I had a wild time. We would say, for example, this is the 1990s, and we would go and do a gig in the north of Ireland, during the Troubles here. And we'd play in a town called Tangergee. You just don't get any more orange than that. And, we're Catholic Dublin Republican band going into the kind of the heart of unionist, loyalist Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And we'd have to get up there and sing and do our own stuff, whatever. And then the surprise in my eyes, after the first gig I ever did like that, where people would just forget about the fact that you're, from Dublin or whatever. And they just kind of love you for it. And I enjoyed a lot of that. But if I was to try and do that now, stress would kill me, Jason.
All right. So I admit that I'm a decade younger than you, in my 40s.
Yeah.
I need to treat my voice better. Right now I treat my voice well by not talking. Like as an example, because of time zones, we're recording in the middle of the day for me and at night for you. Usually I record at night for me. And my usual bit would be, if I'm recording at night, I try and keep talking meetings to a minimum during the day and phone calls to a medium during the day, just to basically save the voice. I'm not saying I couldn't talk all day. I'm just saying, I try to save it so I'm as fresh talking as possible when I do record. This is something brand new to late 30s, 40-year-old me.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is not the way it used to be. In my early 30s, when I was just kind of getting involved in podcasting, I would talk at work all day. I'd get on a couple phone calls with friends, and then I'd hop on a mic at 11 o'clock at night with a West Coast friend and talk for another 3 hours and not think anything of it. And now, if I have a recording tomorrow after this, I don't. But if I did, I'm thinking about all right, so I don't have to talk to anybody again. I can just save it, right? And so it's, I need to treat it better. I almost need to start doing exercises because my only thing now is to just hold it.
No, I can't compliment it more. I mean, I would have gone to a singing coach when I was quite young. But I kind of kept the routines, and I think it's just, for me, you're exactly right. There are people who don't talk all day and they want to have that, that crackling sort of voice that they love, especially this kind of thing that seems to be out now at the moment where women kind of do it a lot, and it does my head in. But my point is that I think for me, I have a kind of a squeaky Irish voice, and it helps me to keep the singing going because I would be I'd have a very high range. I would have been doing White Snake covers and
Okay.
stuff like, and and like I'd be a kind of like, they used to call me in the key of Ken, because like I was the
Nice.
guy who would do it in the key, the original key, and they'd all say, "You sure you want to try that?" And say, "Yeah, of course I want to try. Come on, it's only Journey. Who cares?" And then I realized, like, as I got on a little bit later, I wasn't able to do that. So but it's still the one thing that does it still ensures that I can at least sing in tune is that I do the exercises and I do sing a lot. So yeah, it's really important,
I think it's very important. So when you're not in the audio space and you're not singing, what are you doing for fun?
That's a good question. But you see, the thing is, I kind of it's so involved. It's this portal for me to learn so much more about my hobbies. So like, for example, I was doing some work with a musician there recently, and he found out that I was doing podcasting. So he contacted me, about some tips sort of thing. And then I ended up going to gigs and sort of, following him along a little bit on his journey. And so, yeah, it really works. I find I this is kind of really my hobby.
Okay.
But if for downtime, if you mean for downtime, actually, I do enjoy. I think streaming is the greatest invention that's ever happened. I love going back to programs and TV shows that I really enjoyed, and to be able to see them in this incredible HD, quality. It's just amazing. I'm kind of addicted to Star Trek Enterprise, and it wasn't the most liked Star Trek.
Okay, so you're speaking my language because I am undertaking a Star Trek journey. I didn't know any. I only kind of knew of Trek, right? And so I'm let's do some math real quick. 2, 7, 9. I'm 9.5 seasons away from Enterprise because I'm 5 seasons into Deep Space Nine.
Yeah.
Next on my journey would be Voyager, and then I'll get to Enterprise.
Okay, that's cool because I actually started the opposite way. My little daughter's watching Enterprise with me now because it's kind of the first in the timeline.
Yeah, so
she has it kind of that way.
I have an appreciation for the fact that this stuff exists. I also went back further. I don't know if you've done this, but like a few years ago, maybe at the height of the pandemic, my now wife and I went back and started watching Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, which was
oh wow, that's really old.
But that
was on an RTA back in the 80s, like.
Yeah, but I wanted to go back as far as possible, and while it's not been redone in HD, so it's just kind of in standard. But it's amazing to go back to it, and
it was kind of done in psychedelic D, wasn't it? Really, lots of really garish colors and Goldie Hawn pouncing around a bit.
But I love the idea that we can just go back. Like it's not as throwaway, I think, as maybe it once was. Is there a reason you've gone straight back to Enterprise and not like just back to Star Trek in general?
Oh yeah, good question. No, I really like Enterprise. I enjoy Enterprise a lot. Even when it came out in 1999, 2000, I was very into it. I was kind of couldn't wait for it, because I used to read a lot of Star Trek novels, and obviously with Star Trek novels you can get a bit more of a historical scope.
Yeah.
And I remember reading some of the earlier novels about, the beginning and the Federation, all this stuff. We're getting very nerdy here. But anyway, that really excited me. Because I wanted to see what the ships looked like. And the only kind of clue we had was the Daedalus ship in Cisco's, desk on his desk.
Yeah.
And, I remember thinking it looked crap. And I kind of said, I really hope they don't go with that one. And they didn't, thankfully. But, I have a lot of complaints about Enterprise. There's lots of stuff that if I was in charge of it, I'd change. And I'm a real sticker for canon. I don't like the way these modern TV Star Trek ones are kind of just taking canon and just dumping it in the bin. I'm very strict on canon. So I thought Enterprise did okay. I'd give it like a 7 out of 10 in terms of canon. But I just liked it because, it was modern at the time. It talked about, diversity and color and all that kind of thing. And it did it in a nice way. And I have to be honest, I really like Scott Bakula. I mean, I really liked him in Quantum Leap.
Okay.
So when he became the captain, and I knew he was going to be the captain, I was really excited about that. So see, that's a kind of like it's a little bit. It's my favorite. It's my kind of when I go back to it, and I just quickly again, I'll diverse just a little bit. I like, for example, I watched what's the name of that? What was that show that was out a couple of years ago where they were kind of going around their solar system?
Discovery?
No, it's not Star Trek. It was the other kind of thing. The one that was on, it was on Netflix, and then it was kind of cancelled about 3 times. I can't think of the name of
it. Not the Orville.
No, not the Orville. It was kind of more darker.
Okay.
Anyway, I can't remember. It'll come to me in a second. I was watching this, and every second seeing somebody was getting a bullet in the head or being, spaced, as they call it. It was really hard to watch, and I go back to Enterprise then, because it was kind of like, it's kind of optimistic, and it was kind of like fresh and it kind of like a balm. Do you know what I mean? And like, because I find Star Trek, modern Star Trek is way too noisy in both sound and visuals.
Okay.
It's too hard to watch. And whereas I find modern science fiction shows that are out are very violent. And I don't always agree that science fiction nowadays has to be like all the other dramas on TV and be very, very violent. So that's what I like about Star Trek. It's not unnecessarily violent. I don't know whether you think about that as well.
I mean, I go back to I at the moment, and obviously it's very limited. I still think the original series is my favorite, and I think
it's great.
Part of it is that same exact reason. Like, it's not violent. They're talking it out. They're, sometimes there's fights, but like for the most part, they're talking it out. And even Next Gen, for the most part, it's never shoot first, which I feel like that's not just modern Trek necessarily. That's all science fiction now. Even the glory days of Battlestar Galactica's reboot on sci-fi. They didn't shoot first, even though, like, no, it's so. I think there is an I think in all media, when you are in any life or death scenario where you can talk about it, talk it out first instead of shoot first. Yeah, that's optimistic.
No, I agree. And that show I was trying to remember was The Expanse. Okay. And I found a lot of, I did a lot of research into the actual story, and I found that a lot of guys, aged 25 to 45 really liked that show. And whereas I asked a couple of ladies I knew and who were mad into sci-fi, I asked them about it and they didn't like it. Okay. Whereas they enjoyed something like, say, for example, Three Body Problem, which was out a while back. And then a lot of girls I was talking to, they really enjoyed Silo. I don't know if you know about Silo, but Silo was an Apple production. And they like that, so I think it was just, while The Expanse was definitely very good in terms of visuals and so on, and the kind of politics in it was very interesting, it didn't kind of bring something fresh to sci-fi as far as I was concerned. Now I know I'm kind of in a less percentage than most people would, but I do like what you're saying about Next Generation, because it actually, when you look back on the shows, some of them are a bit cheesy, but when you're trying to make 20 episodes in one season, then you will get cheesy ones. But the thing is, the show was never rushed. So you never felt that they were flying towards the end of a storyline. And as you say, it exhumed class, didn't it? Yeah. It was a very classy show. Like, when Picard would make a speech, like one sticks out for me. I remember there was a trial where a young chap who was a Vulcan Romulan being accused of being a spy and so on. And it was getting really out of hand. I think the show was called The Drumhead. And Picard, made this fantastic speech at the end. And I look back and I go, bloody hell, that's Star Trek. How, you can't have speeches as good as that. And yet, it was all about class. And I think that's something that really means that it stands the test of time. And, when they went back with Picard, I, along with everyone else, felt disappointed in the first couple of seasons because it didn't seem to be what people wanted. And when they took the third series and went back with the Next Generation crew and, it all went back, people just fell on their knees praising it,
I think
because don't ruin a good thing.
I think that's what we want, though. And that's why we gravitate towards those things. And any other shows I'm sure we can mention that aren't sci-fi. Like, we want to watch class, but it's also like when you and I do this show, when you do your show, like, we want to put it out classy as well. We don't want it to be schlock. We don't want it to just be another thing for the heap or the playlist.
Yeah.
We want you to remember this.
Yeah, no, you're right. And you know something, the feedback I get sometimes from my episodes, it really knocks me out because that's exactly what people say. There was 2 words that I always had in my head that I never wanted to do. You know, I never wanted to have any gotcha moments in an interview.
Yeah.
So I always kind of send people in advance the general questions I'd like to ask. And I kind of find that the feedback from guests in particular has been very positive, where people say, I really felt comfortable at the start of the interview because I knew what you were going to start with and I knew, you know, where we were going to go. And I think that's important if you want to make your guests kind of talk a little bit more.
Yeah.
You know, and then the other thing I always meant was it was never about me. And I never ever, cause I said this earlier on, but it was really important not to talk over the guest or give them an opinion based on what they've said. I generally would kind of take in what they've said and then kind of dwell on that or you know, kind of elaborate on it. And I think that's, you know, that's looking at, say, do you know who's a huge influence for me? You're going to probably laugh this, but you know, Dick Cavett.
Yeah, I love Dick Cavett.
Yeah, he was amazing. And when I was doing the comfortable spot and I was kind of working up to it and sourcing it out and kind of storylining it, in a sense, I watched tons of his interviews. He
might be the most underrated now. I mean, people of our age and older know Dick Cavett, but I don't think enough young people know. Like, have you heard the good interview of Dick Cavett?
I know. And you know, he has to have people, he had people on shows like, you know, he'd have somebody like, you know, a pop star or whatever, but then he'd have Gore Vidal on.
Yeah.
You know, and he'd be kind of going, that's a really, you know, that's a good sign of somebody who's very comfortable in their role. He never wanted to be the star. You know, he'd always just come in with a quick quip that would kind of, you know, diffuse the situation between 2 aggravated guests. He's brilliant like that. He had a class about him as well. You know, he had that real smooth, you know, early talk radio, 60s kind of style. Never get excited, never raise his voice, never do anything like that. And it wasn't, you know, I mean, I wouldn't have put him down as visually great for TV. You know, he was kind of scrawny looking a little bit, you know, and he wasn't perfect television, but, you know, he was definitely perfect kind of interview. And he did a wonderful job of, as I said, controlling the interview, but never being never being the topic or the subject matter. That's when I talk to people and they ask me about like anything I should watch if I want to learn how to do podcasting and in doing interviewing, I always say to them, go online, just line up a load of Dick Cavett videos and just watch him. Don't watch the guests, just watch him. Don't get taken away by the level or the gravity of who he's interviewing. Just watch him. And when you compare him, say, to Johnny Carson, it's good. Carson was okay. He was good for that show, but he certainly wasn't in the same league.
There's a lot to this conversation, as there is to most. But often, I always come back to something specific. And in this instance, I still can't get over Ken from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean name-dropping one of my favorite interviewers in Dick Cavett. It's not that Cavett isn't known the world over. For a time, he was arguably as big as any other television interviewer, but there's something about him that I find better than the rest. And with Ken, and probably many others, I know I'm not alone. But it does prove one thing. We're never truly aware of how connected our influences can be with others. Long before this show came into being, even before I was listening to podcasts, I bought my parents a box set of Dick Cavett and, as you do, I watched all of My Gift to them. And while Ken and I only briefly touched on music, I'm sure there would be at least some crossover there, and of course there's Star Trek. And so the deeper you go, the more you find out you have in common. This is the great thing about the meandering conversation. You never know what you'll discover or how connected you may be to somebody where philosophy or influences are concerned. So, where do we go from here? I think we could start by acknowledging that our influences are not who we are or who we become, but they do say a great deal about us. Dick Cavett is one of my influences, as is Mark Maron, David Mitchell, Douglas Copeland, Chuck Klosterman, Len Dayton, David Letterman, and Duff McKagan. These are not my only influences, but they are some that at this time seem to guide me in some way. What are yours? Who is influencing you? And because I feel like asking the school teacher question, how is who is influencing you different from an influencer? I'll accept all essays in written form with word counts between 1 and 2,000 words. Thanks for listening to the Palmer Files, episode 142. And now for the official business. The Palmer Files releases every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. If you're still listening, I encourage you to join the discussion. You can find all related ways to contact my guest Ken and myself in the show notes. You can visit Ken's website, thecomfortablespotpodcast.com, where on the About page, you'll also find links to the Moldovan Coffee Break and Lydia's Booktastic podcast that he mentioned during this episode. The music for this episode was provided by Henno Heitur. Email and essays can be sent to this show at thepalmerfiles@gmail.com. And remember, your home for all things Agent Palmer is agentpalmer.com. All right, Ken, do you have one final question for me?
Yes, I have a really good question. And I think it's a question that a lot of people in Ireland and the UK and now in Europe kind of ask. Why is it that people in the US are so hard for them to understand what socialism is?
It's because I've got a friend who's a longtime Republican, not an extreme Republican. He's like middle of the road Republican. And he and I used to have these wonderful 30, 50, 2-hour minute coffee politic conversations.
Yeah.
And we always came back to the same thing, which is my answer to your question. We require better education.
Yeah.
And it's just, I like to think that I escaped my high school.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't graduate my high school. And I think if you want to know why people don't understand what socialism is, it's because they don't learn anything. We aren't taught in high school. Like my father is, and his brothers always talk about, the way it was in the 50s, 60s, 70s when they were in high school and college.
Mm-hmm.
The education that they got was exponentially better than what I received in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
And even in college and university in the early aughts. And I think that degradation has been a bit of I think it's been on purpose by some powers that be. And I think it's to the detriment of the U.S. But the average American may be too dumb to realize that it's to the detriment of the U.S. And so you end up with, I'm going to teach my kid what I want, or you can't teach my kid that.
Gotcha.
And so they're not exposed to these things. So they'll probably at some point in a government class or a culture class, learn the definition of socialism along with the definition of fascism. But after that day where they have, where they learn that definition, they never think about it again.
Oh, yeah.
And when you think about the things that you learn, the concepts that you remember from elementary school, middle school, high school, and college and university, it's the things that you learn on a regular basis that aren't word definition. Hopefully you get it on the test and then we'll never touch it again. The stuff that's not that you remember.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the reason. That's the reason we don't know the definitions for all these things. And I think the other part is there's something we got very wrong. We have allowed nerd and geek to be cool, but not anything more than superficially. Like, we're all right that everybody likes Star Trek or Star Wars or Lord of the Rings. That's cool. We're not really 100% on board with the whole geek nerd stereotype of, but it's still cool to read.
Yeah.
Right.
I get you.
And so while we've embraced some of the content, we've lost some of the context. And so, that's kind of that's one of the pieces that we've left in the background as Yeah,
and it's just, I just ask you that question because I think, some of the kind of left-leaning politicians in the United States, they're getting a lot of exposure. Alexandra Cortez, or things, or AOC. Like, for example, like when we look at her in Ireland and in Europe, I have a lot of European friends. So she's like considered a center left, whereas most people in America would consider her an extreme left. And it's just weird that we kind of say, does no one actually kind of look up what a social democrat is really? Well, because if they did know, they'd probably realize it was them anyway. They are, most people are social democrats. They just don't know it, and that's not just in America. I think. No,
I think one of the problems is that she is extreme left by comparison.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you know what I mean? Like on a scale for how far right the far right can be. Yeah.
The whole line is moved.
Yeah, so that I think that's part of it. The other thing is,
somebody needs to get a spirit level out on that line. That little bubble, putting it right in. There you go, guys. It's been reset. Everybody get off the ground.
But I think the other thing is there's also a lack of international politics education where, like, so we were talking off mic, but like I watch British panel shows, and having watched British panel shows for 2 decades now, I have a general understanding of UK/British politics,
and Irish as well,
and so Irish and Scottish, and like I understand, like I understood Brexit probably better than a lot of people around me.
Probably more than some of the English you voted for.
If you can understand the satire, you clearly understand the whole concept, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think by comparison, because I understand what a liberal Democrat is, and a social democrat is, I understand how to put that in the context of what a Republican or a Democrat in the United States would be.
Yeah.
And so,
I think so. Yeah.
Losing that context means that she could stay exactly where she is. You could take a middle of the road, like, let's be honest for a moment, like Biden is as middle of the road Democrat as you could be. But the problem is he seems like an extreme leftist because the right keeps moving farther to the right. And so by comparison, and I think that's where, so I think if it was like a sport, like let's say we're talking about football and, I'm not offside and you're maybe going to think about kicking the ball to me, kick the ball to me so I can stay onside. Great. That's situational awareness.
Yeah.
We, as I think Americans, have very little situational awareness as a whole. And so we always wait too long. So I will always be offsides when the ball is kicked by an American.
It's like the political version of not being able to parallel park. It's just but I get that, and you see the issue is that we would consider Joe Biden center right, actually. He would be, because I don't mean it as in he'd have right wing leanings.
No, I get it.
The very nature, by the fact that he's been in politics for 40 years, means he's a career politician, and most career politicians in the UK and Ireland would be center right. So in other words, they'd be okay for LGBTQ laws being passed and all that kind of stuff. But they wouldn't be so much in favor, say, of state nationalization. So, they would be very soft conservatives. So that's how we would see Biden. We kind of laugh when we say Biden's mad lefty. It's like, good Lord, come to Ireland and you'll see what the lefty's all about. You'll get an awful surprise then. Anyway, I'm sorry for dumping that question on you. I just thought it might be an interesting question, particularly, this year has been that I think in America, even in your, as you look at it yourselves and as we look at it, the question of, there's such a the split, it's right down the middle, and, people are just kind of polarized, and it's not always been like that. I don't remember America like that,
It truly isn't like that, but I think the downfall has been not only the lack of education, but there's a lack of compassion now.
Oh, I agree 100%. People just don't care, that's the thing. And it's here as well.
And when they don't care, they double down on not being wrong. This is my thing now is it's not about being right anymore. It's just about not being wrong.
Yeah, I agree. And that's another big thing for me when I interview somebody in my podcast. And it's, sometimes it might get somebody and I won't agree with them, but I'm mature enough to just let them say what they want to say.
I usually just stay away from politics or religion. I don't even
mean in politics. I just mean say, for example, something culture based or maybe they might have, and I think that's what I'm saying. Everything is kind of political now, isn't it? That's the problem. Whereas I try and make my podcast not go down that road. I don't make everything political. Sometimes they might say something and just go, yeah, just breezes over. And just leave it at that.
I don't know if this was for better or worse, but during the pandemic, when I had a guest on, I would say, we're not going to talk about the pandemic.
Okay.
I would literally be like, we're going to talk about this, that, and the other thing. And I know your work or your career or your hobbies. I know your life's impacted by it. Nobody's tuning into this show for that reason. And so you don't really know, if somebody mentions it offhand, like, oh, I've got more free time now because of the, that's fine. I didn't edit it out, but I also didn't. If you go back during those things that were recorded and released at the height of it, it just doesn't happen. And part of it is because I'm aware this is supposed to be an escape. And it was my reason for that. And so it's kind of the other reason I stay away from politics usually is because this is supposed to be an escape. This is a cup of coffee with friends. Ken?
No, you're absolutely right. And I agree 100% actually. And I have a new series out at the moment, which is kind of like it's periodical. It comes out every couple of weeks. It's called 2.5 Pints. And I discuss politics, social society and kind of, other cultural things. So it does get a bit political, all right, but it's only for that. And I never bring it into my other podcast because the comfortable spot is exactly what it says on the tin. It's just a nice, comfy place where I don't have to think about those things. So yeah, I think it's okay to do that when you're doing, if you have different opinions on politics. I always say, push it into a section that will work. Don't bring it into other things because you'll only end up spoiling the broth,
Yeah.